Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Daniel. I work with Insight Collaborative as the Director of Outreach. We host webinars every month on different subjects related to migration. And I'm really excited this week because we have a brilliant panel with really varied interests and expertise from all over the world. And it's also such an important topic as well. Migration tends to be in the news a great deal, often with a lot of inaccuracies and myths and misconceptions spread about. But even then, the things that are reported on are usually, they tend to be at the simpler end of the legal spectrum, I suppose. And today we will be discussing the more complex side of migration, what we're calling perspectives from the grey areas. Now, usually I would introduce each panelist and then we'd move on to the questions. But if our panelists are okay with it, I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves today, just because we've had some people join at fairly short notice and I don't have bios for everyone. So I hope you're all okay if I put you on the spot. Laura, you're already unmuted. Would you like to start us off?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Daniel. So my name is Laura Brody. I'm a researcher, and in my work I focus on issues of nationalism, memory, and belonging, but all in the context of forced migration. And so I'm currently working on an EU project on migration, and my research focuses mostly on migrant and minority communities in Greece and Turkey. And before this, I also worked, with NGOs in this area in places like Cyprus, Palestine, the US, and other places as well. So yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you to the organizers and to the other panelists as well. And I look forward to learning from all of you as well.
Thank you, Laura. Sonia, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to join this webinar. My name is Sofia. I'm from Ukraine, and I'm working here on issue of statelessness. I'm a project manager of the project, which provision of legal assistance to stateless population in Ukraine. And I have some experience working with refugees in Lebanon, and looking forward to hear from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Zico, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Can I be heard? Yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Zico. I'm from an organization from Indonesia called SUAKA. So SUAKA itself is a non-governmental organization focusing on the protection of refugee rights in Indonesia, and our core activity is the legal aid for asylum seeker and refugees with UNHCR arrest process, and also with the domestic law. So I'm in SUAKA as the campaign and public awareness coordinator, and yeah, I'll leave it to that. Looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of other panelists who may or may not be able to join us. One of them has had a meeting overrun and they will try and join us later if they can. And the other one seems to be having connection issues. We will introduce them if they're able to join us later. The way this conversation will be structured is around a series of questions which I will be asking all of the panelists, and then we'll discuss the answers to some of those questions. But I also just want to emphasize to the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, either if you've come to this discussion with burning questions, or if the discussion inspires some questions in you, then please do type them either into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will relay them to our panelists at an appropriate time. And you can also send them to me anonymously if you'd like to do so. But for now, I'll start with our first question, which is, can you outline the legal situation and the context in your area for migrants? And that may be the area you're currently living in or the area that you have worked most in. Laura, could you start us off again, please?
Yes, of course. So I can talk about this in the context of Turkey in particular, and it's really important because Turkey, as many of us know, it currently hosts the largest number of refugees in the world. There are over 3.6 million Syrian refugees, but also more than 370,000 refugees of, I think, mostly Iraqi, Iranian, and Afghani origin. And so it's really important to think about this in that context. But Turkey is actually one of the few countries that maintains the geographic limitation on the 1951 Refugee Convention. And so this means that it only applies international laws to refugees of European origin. And so non-European origin refugees, which have been the majority of refugees in Turkey in recent decades, thus lack the right to apply for asylum and to settle in Turkey. And so instead, these groups are provided a temporary protection status until they can be settled in a third country by UNHCR or another body. And really, so they're kind of in limbo between these national and international institutions. But one key turning point in Turkey's migration laws in the last decade has been the implementation of the LFIP. Some of you may have heard of this. It's the law on foreigners and international protection. And so this led to the establishment of the DGMM in Turkey, which is an institution now responsible for monitoring the situation of migrants. But the law itself doesn't actually lift this geographical limitation that I mentioned. So that's been one of its main criticisms, and non-European origin migrants still have to register now with ASAM, which is the UNHCR's partner in Turkey, to be considered for third country resettlements, and also with this new institution, the DGMM. So this kind of two-tier system from before the era before the LFIP stayed in place. But it also did something else, this law, which was really important and complicated things further for Syrian refugees in particular, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the majority. So there are over 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey still. And so this law created kind of a third status. It's this special category of the conditional refugee. And so this essentially, it makes Syrians ineligible to apply for resettlement outside of Turkey through UNHCR. It's not the same, however, as the conditional refugee status that they have in Turkey is not the same as actual refugee status, though. So it's still temporary, meaning that Syrians are additionally, prevented from applying for any form of long-term legal status or citizenship in Turkey, and so they're simply, stuck in limbo. And so, overall, all non-European origin refugees in Turkey, they're also assigned by this new institution to a specific city. And so they're unable to freely move throughout the country without legal consequences. And this also, it's become really quite a dire situation, as you can imagine. And, as I'm sure we'll discuss more in a moment, this idea of, guesthood or temporality for migrants of non-European origin in Turkey is really the short-term vision. And so the issue with the legal regime is that it's not designed for the long term. And what it really means is that most individuals who do remain in Turkey in the long term, which are actually most individuals, are kind of stuck in between the lines. So they struggle with work, healthcare, education, all kinds of institutional barriers for this reason, in addition to, linguistic, psychological, other types of social barriers, which, creates a very unstable and precarious situation for them. So thank you I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, I think that aspect of the temporariness of the status there is something we'll probably see a lot of today. But yeah, it's certainly a key feature of a lot of the people that I've met when working in Greece and Lebanon as well, is it always seems to be very temporary and unstable. It would be good next, I think, to hear from Ziko about the situation in Indonesia, where I understand the status of asylum seekers is even more unstable. Is that right, Ziko?
Well, you could say that, but yeah, certainly the situation with the refugees and asylum seeker is not much more better than what what Laura just mentioned. The only significant difference is, while Turkey is a host for millions of refugees, Indonesia only hosts for like 14,000, less a little bit than 14,000 people compared to Thailand of 500,000 and Malaysia with 250,000. So it's very have a big significant difference compared to even the other countries in the region of Southeast Asia. But yeah, we also have a very similar limbo situation where, refugees, I'm sure that you all are aware that with the resettlement very bleak, and the people closing borders with the xenophobia sentiments, a refugee living in Indonesia is not going anywhere anytime soon. And also we are hosting from the 14,000, we are hosting the half of that if the Afghanistan origins, Hazara ethnicities. So with the current situation with Afghanistan fall to the Taliban, there's not much any option left because they cannot afford to use the mechanism of the voluntary repatriation, and also they cannot be the citizen of Indonesia because Indonesia is not the signatory of the 1951 convention. And also they mostly they are what they call really hoping with the resettlement, but again, like I mentioned before, the resettlement is very bleak, and the opportunities for the chances for the refugees going with the resettlement is very low. And yeah, that's a little bit somber note from Indonesia, but there are still a little bit progress in terms of the protection since 2016. We already have the presidential regulation that acknowledging at least the terms of refugees. So the refugees in Indonesian legal regulation is already acknowledged, and there are specific procedure what to do and who does what in Indonesia government agency when they encounter refugees. For example, the Rohingyas who's came across the coast of Aceh, or even people arriving through the airport. So we already have that specific regulation before we don't have. And we also have the ministry circular letter that what you call ensuring that the refugee children in the elementary school age can access the public schools. So that's a very good progress in our terms. And also we are still working with the advocacy to the refugee empowerment, economic empowerment advocacy. So we are pushing the government to at least let the refugees to work because, yeah, like it or not, want it or not, the refugees are living in Indonesia much more longer than traditionally expected. So we cannot rely upon the international donation or international charity anymore, because that's just not sustainable for refugee population here in Indonesia. So it is still a long way for the economic empowerment advocacy, but it is something that we have started at least 2 or 3 years. So we can expect yeah, a little bit progress day by day, and yeah, I leave it to that. If you have any questions, I'll be more welcome to elaborate.
Thank you. It's really good to know that there have at least been some positive steps made, even if it is still slow progress. I think given the growing hostility in mainstream discourse around migration all over the world, I feel like even slow progress is something to be celebrated at the moment. Sophia, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'll talk a bit about stateless population, since this is a bit different from refugees, but sometimes it can be connected to refugee status or refugee situation, but it can be also different. So I'll outline the brief situation in the world, or the brief description of the problem, for better understanding the topic I'm talking about. So currently the statelessness is actually world problem. It's you can find stateless population anywhere in the world. Currently, there are about 10 million people who are stateless in the world. And what are the reasons? They can be different, starting from discrimination, for example, gender discrimination. There are about 25 or 26 countries in the world which laws does not allow women to pass nationality to their children. Mostly these are Muslim Arab countries. So basically, if the woman has a child without a legal marriage with a man from that country, the child will be stateless, no matter how long the child lives there. It's also the case in Lebanon, where I was volunteering with refugees, for example. The other discrimination reason might be ethnicity. This also works for, mostly it works for also some of Arab countries, but also African countries. There are people who are denied of nationality of country because they belong to one of the ethnicities that is not recognized by the government. One of the most famous cases are actually Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. They are both refugees, but they are also stateless, because this is the whole big, huge group of people who are denied to be recognized as citizens of Myanmar. The other reasons for statelessness are legal gaps in legislation. So there are some gaps that that make problem for people to be recognized as national of one or another state. This can be also connected to collapse of like big countries, such as happened, for example, in Soviet Union 30 years ago. That's actually the case we are working mostly in Ukraine. Even Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago, we still face difficulties for many people who cannot prove their citizen of Ukraine, of Russia, Belarus, and other countries, because people, of course, it's connected to migration. It was one huge country, so people moved from one country to another country. They didn't register their place of residence. They didn't find work on time. They cannot prove they were living in one or another country when the countries were becoming independent. And so people are staying without documents for like 30 years, even though they don't even migrate. They probably live in Ukraine for the last 29 years, since 90s or 80s even, but they cannot prove they actually nationals of Ukraine or other country. What was done in the world to combat this? There is currently a 10-year program. So this program, Statelessness and Refugees, they are both under mandate of UNHCR. So these are two main issues UNHCR work with, and statelessness is one of them. And in 2014, they launched a big campaign to end statelessness till 2024 in the world. It's like a huge, big program, which I don't know if it's possible to actually end whole statelessness situation in the whole world. I'm not even sure it's possible to do it in Ukraine, unfortunately, but there is a campaign and there are quite a lot of things done to combat statelessness. For example, the project I'm working in was actually launched also because of this campaign. It's called I Belong, because people who don't have citizenship, they mostly do not belong, they are invisible. The countries are encouraged to sign the conventions. There are two UN conventions on statelessness. One of them is convention relating to status of stateless persons, 1954. And the other one is 1961 convention on the reduction of statelessness. Both of them working and provide like legal definition and also some norms, principles for countries to sign and to prevent further cases of statelessness, like the child who will be otherwise stateless and is born, for example, in Ukraine, should be Ukrainian nationals, no matter who the parents' nationality or stateless status or whatever. And coming to Ukraine, there are about 35,000 people who are stateless here. It's very, these are not, the number is very approximate. We actually don't know how many people. There might be much more. And currently in Ukraine, we have, I guess you know, the conflict on the eastern part of Ukraine, and also the Crimea is occupied. And so there are rising cases of statelessness connected to that, because people cannot register their children with state authorities in Ukraine. They are getting either no birth certificate at all, or they are getting a certificate from unrecognized country. And then the birth certificate is the first connection of a person to the state. So basically there is a name, there is place of birth, parents, nationalities. So this is a first paper that can prove connection of the person to that state. And if people lack it, that causes a lot of problems. So, and currently, by also estimation of UNHCR, there are about 70,000 children whose birth was not registered in Ukraine since 2014, which might be a huge load on us if or when these territories will be back to Ukraine. And there might be much more cases of statelessness or risk of statelessness. And as if you talk only about 35,000 people who are mentioned before, these are mostly people who lived on the territory of post-Soviet countries. Some of them, like probably even half or one-third of people were even born in Ukraine and were staying in Ukraine for like whole their life. But because they moved between countries at that time, because they couldn't prove some documents, they were lacking some documents, their parents lacking documents, they still cannot prove they're Ukrainians or some other nationals, mostly Ukrainians. And that's what we are trying to work with by provision of legal assistance to them. So we go to courts, we advocate for changes in the legislation to make the laws more, I don't know, understanding, taking into account the situation people are in, and things like that. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Sophia. That actually segues really well into our next point, because you mentioned some of the difficulties that people are facing almost because of the vagaries of politics and, you know, countries that no longer exist, or countries that are only recognized by some areas and not by others. And that leads on really nicely to our next question, which is, what challenges do migrants face in a country that doesn't recognize them or their right to exist or their legal status? You know, we've talked about the wider demographics, and I'd love to hear from you now about what challenges are individuals facing. What problems does this cause for a person if their legal status isn't recognized? Laura, would you be happy to start us off again?
Yeah, of course, thank you. And you know, I think this is something that will be similar in many contexts, and some of it's been touched upon already by the others. But you know, when the migration asylum regime in place is designed not to recognize the rights of individuals, it creates exponential problems too many to even discuss here. And you know, this idea of temporality for refugees in Turkey in particular is incredibly consequential. It kind of, when you're kept in limbo between these national and international institutions, and the assistance you're offered is only on par with the poverty level, it really puts individuals on the track of lacking all basic rights, and essentially they're kind of locked into this, you know, extreme position of instability, precarity, and uncertainty, really. You know, there's one example we can draw attention to is access to the labor market. And so many migrants end up entering the informal labor force and being exposed to exploitation in the form of low wages. You know, employers will withhold wages, they'll be forcing individuals to work long hours. And I think one of the key points here is that then they are unable to report abuse to the authorities because they lack the basic right to work in the first place in many contexts. And so the situation is just perpetuated. And, you know, with financial hardships, this is also giving a significant rise in many contexts to child labor and child exploitation. And we see this definitely with Syrian refugees in Turkey, and I'm sure in other contexts, but, you know, families who are literally trying to survive are even ending up willingly allowing their children to work to contribute to family finances. And, you know, another huge issue is healthcare. This also relates to the labor exploitation I just mentioned, because, you know, many individuals in these working conditions end up injured on the job. So in Turkey, Syrians are actually granted, Syrian refugees, I know in particular, are granted free healthcare. But we have to remember that, you know, what is written on paper and what actually happens are two very different things, right? So usually the healthcare they do receive is limited. It doesn't take into account chronic health conditions in urban contexts in particular. Most of the Syrian refugee population in Turkey is in urban contexts. Very few people are in refugee camps. And so, you know, they're kind of living in these slum dwellings and cannot actually access healthcare due to various bureaucratic barriers, even linguistic barriers. But they're also living in these extremely harsh and unsanitary conditions, which have a significant impact on their health. In terms of education as well, I mean, people under temporary protection in Turkey have the right to attend schools, but most don't, or they struggle immensely when they do. I myself, I actually taught in Turkey for some time, and so I saw some of this up close. And, you know, this can be because of a language barrier. It can be because children or teenagers are already working to support the family, so they're not able to attend school. All kinds of other things. There are actually informal, like, minority schools set up for Syrian refugees in Turkey as well, but the Turkish government does not recognize these schools. So again, this creates barriers later on when individuals then, after however many years in these schools, try to re-enter or enter for the first time the Turkish education system because their prior education isn't acknowledged. And so, you know, the list can go on and on. It's more than just, you know, the labor, healthcare, and education, but, you know, I think it's important to think also about the monumental impact this has on, you know, the development of identity and belonging, and you know, which also feeds back into these problems that I'm talking about in the first place. And another huge point is that, you know, in situations where individuals may have access to certain rights or resources, they often lack the knowledge that they either have those rights in the first place or how to tap into them. And actually, in some cases, this benefits countries. Many countries rely on the fact that individuals don't know their rights, so they don't have to provide it to them. And I mean, this really needs to be addressed. I mean, I know in Turkey in particular, especially the labor exploitation that I spoke about, this benefits the national economy. And so, you know, one last thing as well, these issues are certainly kind of not the end point. And I'd like to emphasize that, because in turn, they create other issues on an individual level for people who, you know, are in these dire conditions, and then they're pushed to even more unsafe conditions. So an example of this is that many Syrian refugees now turn to human smuggling to reach Europe. They're unable to apply for third country resettlement through UNHCR under this conditional refugee status. And so when they turn to smugglers, they are also exposed then to other forms of exploitation, human trafficking, and even death, and, you know, a lot of things. And so really it kind of renders them more vulnerable altogether. And I'll leave it there and hear from some of the other panelists, but I'm happy to talk any more about any of those things. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's a really good point, that these things will have an impact going into the future. You know, you mentioned the educational gaps in Turkey. Sophia and I worked together in Lebanon, and we definitely saw some fairly big educational gaps there as well. And of course, that will have an impact on those children, possibly for the rest of their lives. Speaking of, Sophia, would you like to give us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess I won't add anything else to Lebanon and Syrian refugees, but yeah, there is actually a big there are lots of gaps, and I really like, if continuing that topic, I really would like to, I don't know, even learn what's going on now after, I mean, I had been in Lebanon like 5 years ago or 4.5 years ago. But at the same time, I'm even afraid to learn what's going on there, especially with education or with access to some basic rights, because I mean, those children are growing, but nothing changes for them. And the people staying there for like 10 years and also nothing changes. And yeah, and Lebanon now suffers even more. So yeah. And if I may add, I don't know, about stateless in Ukraine, like changing a bit topic and not completely, but so basically stateless in, I will be brief here, stateless in Ukraine, mostly for now, are those people who do not have any documents. So basically they are stateless, not officially, they're just being stateless, they're being undocumented, they're basically hidden from the society. Most of them live somewhere far away in the villages because it's easier for them to find food, find, I don't know, to live there, because they can find some work, like non-qualified, not very low income work, and live there. But in the cities, it's much harder. And also, I mean, sometimes you can be asked about your documents and be detained as well. So basically for now, those people who we consider stateless or undocumented, they are hidden, nobody knows about them, and they don't know, the same as with refugees, they don't even know what rights they have or if they have rights, and they're afraid to approach authorities and ask if they have rights, if they can solve some problem, if they can get documents. They don't even believe already that it's possible. So they just live like that. And of course, if you don't have documents, you have no access to some basic rights. Luckily, in Ukraine, children of undocumented people or who even lack birth certificates, they have right still to education, at least some basic education. And mostly, in most cases, they actually get this education. I mean, sometimes, of course, it depends human factor. Sometimes they're still denied, and the same as parents do not know their rights. They do not go and claim this right for a child to get that education. And some children, of course, lack. But mostly it still works somehow, and children get this access, but only to basic education. But otherwise, people, if they have no documents, they cannot have, they have no access to healthcare systems, they have no access, or they have no right for any social support. They basically don't even know what to claim, but they cannot, even if they know, they cannot have it. They cannot have any other education except this basic education. Of course, they have no right to work. So basically they survive from being unofficially employed, which means they may be, they may not get their payment, or the payment will be very low. They can work for free for some time. The conditions of work may be like really low, and it's Ukraine. I mean, most people, even with documents, not most, but a lot of people, even with documents and being officially employed, don't get this, I don't know, normal conditions of work. I mean, like basic labor. But if people without documents, they don't get any protection at all. And I mean, if something happens, of course, at work, nobody will care at all. So basically they're like invisible, and most people don't understand how it's possible. And even the state authorities who, like migration service, who should work with those cases, sometimes they don't believe those people exist, and they don't believe the people can actually be in such a situation. They don't believe people, they think they are lying, or probably they don't even need documents if they're living for 30 years without them. So there is this stigma or this understanding of people who are in statelessness situation is very low from even public authorities who should know and care and try to solve it, which also brings us to the topic that we cannot solve or change situation until it's fully comprehensible by the country, by the government itself. Yeah, and that's, I guess, my input here.
Thank you. You make it sound very much like a kind of vicious cycle, that people can't get their papers, and so they live for a long time without papers, and then the government says, oh, well, they've already gone 30 years without papers, so they don't need them, which is, I guess, one of the many absurdities of governments with the, government thinking on this.
Exactly.
Thank you. Ziko, what is the situation in Indonesia for kind of individuals who haven't been able to get recognized?
Well, for now, I think in terms of stateless, you mean, or asylum seeker?
Well, either really, whoever you've worked with.
Okay, so for people who are entering Indonesia seeking asylum, so mainly they will, based on the regulation, they will be coordinated with the UNHCR, because like I mentioned earlier, the Indonesia does not sign the 1951 convention, so the government leave the mandates to refugee status determination to UNHCR. So in the event of the refugees arriving in Indonesia through airport or through the boats, there will be the immigration itself will coordinate with UNHCR. At least that's in the regulation written like that. But so far, I think you have came across in the media where, for example, in Rohingya, the boats keep push back or turn back by Thailand, Malaysia, or Indonesia. So there is still a gap, or there is still a problem with the implementation of the presidential regulation itself, because the common sentiment among the governments, Indonesia's still do not have any new arrivals for in Indonesia. So they are trying to be as minimalistic as possible to push for the regulation in terms of protecting their rights or fulfillment of their basic rights, because the government afraid that it would cause a pull factors for the others refugees still living in their original countries. So I think that's the problem with Indonesian in general. But I also want to add a little bit. I think colleague Sofia and Laura in Turkey and Ukraine, I think we share similar problems. Lack of basic rights, lack of the protection for livelihood, for schools, for right to works. But also, I think the one thing with the vicious cycle, of course. But I think the less talk or less discussed factor is about how the refugee is still heavily relying upon the resettlement process, because the advocacy for the right protection itself, at least for me or for my organization, SWAKA, we have two parties to advocate. The first one is the government and the Indonesian publics, and also the refugee community itself. Of course, the government and the public in general need awareness. The awareness for the refugee rights protection still needs to, still has a lot of homeworks. But the interesting part also for the refugee community itself, because things that we are trying to advocate, sometimes they are, many times they are still reluctant, because like I mentioned earlier, they are still heavily relying with the resettlement, which is much more than understandable and valid concern of the refugees. But while they're still living in Indonesia, they still need to do, something very, purposeful and very, very, just to, make their level of survivability in the host countries much more stronger. Like, we are advocating for education and for livelihood, but there are still a faction of the refugee communities does not want to use that opportunities because there are common sentiment of it would lower their vulnerabilities for resettlements, which causing, I don't know, US government or Australia or even the European countries would perceive that, oh, you already, working in Indonesia, you already studying in Indonesia, so why would we, need to resettle you in our countries? So that's the common sentiment that's still happening, at least in Indonesia, to my knowledge. So again, I think advocating for the, I don't know, the refugee crisis, how big of the scale is and how it would impact refugee living in limbo, such as, in Ukraine and in Turkey. I think it's also would be important homework for, I don't know, for 5 or 10 years from now. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Zico. I think that's a really good point, that sometimes the way that we measure or assess asylum claims by vulnerability can create an odd incentive sometimes for people to try and present themselves as vulnerable, or to actually sabotage their own efforts to try and to have more chance of being offered asylum where they want to go. That actually, again, leads quite nicely into our next question. But before I do, I'm just going to post Insight Collaborative's social media links into the chat. We run webinars every month on different topics. So if you're interested in seeing more of these panel discussions, please do follow us on social media. We've had a comment in the chat, but we haven't had any questions. So we do still have time. If anyone would like to ask any questions of our panelists, please do paste them into the chat. We did have a request for Laura to provide us with some further reading, which she's kindly offered to do. But if there are any other questions, do just type them into the chat. Until then, I will ask our last question of our excellent panelists, which is going from the individual to the very big, really, in the sense that what I'd like to know is, what changes would you like to see in migration policy to address the challenges that we've talked about today? You've all outlined some different issues with migration policy and statelessness policy. So what is it that needs to be changed to actually address those issues? Sophia, could you start us off, please?
Yes, sure. So I'll start with my stateless. Okay. So basically, we had really good changes in the legislation quite recently, like half a year ago. For a person to undocumented person to, let's say, start living officially, have legal status and have documents, we can move in two different, not different, but in two ways. Either we're trying to gather documents, whatever we can, and prove through courts and representing those people in other authorities like migration service, and try to prove they are nationals of Ukraine, or represent them in consulate and confirm their foreign nationality. But also this is one way. For some people it's still possible, and we are doing this. But in other, like for some people it's impossible, no matter what we are doing. I mean, legally, of course, because they fall exactly in those gaps, or in the legislation in different countries, migration and so on. So basically, the only opportunity for them to become visible for the society, for the government, is to have official statelessness status, so to be recognized as stateless officially. And basically, this law was our parliament made this law last year, and only this year in April, May, it was implemented. So there was some other legislation to have it like really working. And only now, for those people who couldn't solve their situation at all with any means, we could help them apply for this procedure of statelessness determination procedure. So after half a year, they're becoming officially stateless. They are given a document that they are stateless and temporary. For the beginning, they obtain temporary residence permit, which after 2 years they can change into permanent residence permit, and after some more years they can become nationals of Ukraine if they're constantly living here. So basically this was a major change in the legislation, and now people even like having still quite long way to go, because it's minimum like altogether 5 years or even more. It's still, they already can work with this residence permit. They can get access to some other rights, not all of them, but some of them, and they're already official here, and they have some status. And I mean, some of them are so happy to receive at least something, even the documents that they applied for that status, because it's the first, like really first document where they have their photo and name and date of birth and from the official body of Ukraine. It's just unbelievable how people react to that, even if there's no rights yet with that document. So basically, this was a major change that already happened in Ukraine, and we were also advocating for those changes in the legislation itself. And currently, we need to continue monitoring implementation of that legislation, and we are ready to advocate or change, advocate for changes and give recommendation to make this law work better. But also we are focusing on, because people still being recognized as stateless, they don't get many rights. They have already more and they are visible, but they still don't have like full rights as a person who are national, for example, of Ukraine. I mean, I'm not talking about voting rights. I'm talking about even like healthcare, social rights, those education, access to education and so on, but which is quite important. So we are analyzing currently legislation of Ukraine for those people who have this temporary residence permit. And we are planning to give our recommendation to government to change like this legislation for better, so that people who've been living here for many years and who could solve their situation only now, and not because they didn't want, but because they didn't have any chance to do so before, they will be living like everyone and be really belonging to that like country, community, people. So this is what we are currently doing, and what changes we need currently in that sphere. And also we are still, and this is actually what is important in other countries where they're stateless, because not so many countries in the world. There are about 25 countries who actually have the statelessness determination procedure, even though it's not solving like status as a national, but this, as I told, it gives already some official status to a person. Most countries don't have it yet, so people still cannot solve their situation at all. And what is also important is to bring in line legislation on citizenship itself. So basically, to take away all norms in the legislation, or to change them in easier way, so that people who actually can be national state, who were living, for example, hold their life in one country, they could, or children born in that country, or as it in some countries who cannot, like women who cannot pass their nationalities to their children. So this legislation should be also changed in line with international norms, so that to prevent further cases of statelessness. That's what we are working in Ukraine, what we can do, and like it's important for basically every country in the world, even like Western European countries who has more, who has better approach to those questions in general.
Thank you. That's really interesting and quite shocking. I hadn't actually realized that so few countries actually have that determination procedure, especially given how many countries either have stateless populations of their own or have stateless refugees coming to them. This is something that I experienced here in the UK. In my last job, I was working with a charity that worked with people in immigration detention, and I met quite a few people who had come to the UK from various countries on the Arabian Peninsula, where there are whole ethnicities which are essentially stateless because they live in states which don't want to recognize them. Yeah, sorry.
That was actually also the case in Lebanon. I had a chance to participate in one of the meeting of, I guess, NRC, when they were talking actually to women in Lebanon who give birth to children there, for Syrian women, refugees. I mean, some of them, we know there are some big part of refugees at the moment when I was there, they were not officially already recognized as refugees. So basically, if they were not recognized in Lebanon as refugees, they give birth to a child. I mean, even with husband, it's not gender question, it's more about cross-country refugee question. And I remember those women, they didn't know how to register birth of their child in Lebanon. And actually, they were explained that it's impossible for them. For them to register their child, they should have gone to Syria. But also, if they go to Syria, I mean, first it's question of safety, but also if they go to Syria, they might lose their status, even with UNHCR refugee status. And so they are trapped in that situation when they cannot like register their children, and they also had to pay a lot of money. I don't remember already but there was this like vicious cycle again. They couldn't do this even if they wanted to do so. And again, if they do not register the child is, I don't know, 10 years old, 15 years old, and they still in this asylum seeking or refugee situation, I don't even know how they will prove then which nationality those children will have in future when they will need to obtain passport or ID card, because I mean, we don't know when this Syria will be like, and how they will solve it as well when everything will be fine there. So this creates like this refugee situation creates even more problem for people and to contributes to like statelessness, to growth of statelessness.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Ziko, what are your thoughts on this? What can improve or change in Indonesian policy and society to support people whose status isn't recognized, or asylum seekers?
Yeah, that's a pretty hard question. I mean, yeah, I think the awareness of the importance of the rights-based approach and whole society approach in the Indonesian context is important. We need to be aware of the needs of this community and try to address it. And we also have to emphasize that we cannot work without each other, by ourselves. The refugee community working by themselves, the government, and also the civil society, need to work in synergies, because it will be more difficult in the future if that does not happen. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, and I always repeating it, like it or not, wanting or not, the refugee will stay much longer in asylum countries, in Ukraine, in Turkey, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and without honoring and protecting their rights, really affected their well-beings, and that would potentially harm the relationship with the host community itself. In the past year, at least, we in Indonesia saw that 10 refugee committed suicide, and right now we are seeing refugee protests and demonstration across Indonesia on daily basis, at least for the last 3 weeks. And there are groups that showing their mouth going on hunger strikes, and recently even one person conduct self-immolation. So that's just to show how bleak the well-being situation here in Indonesia, and affecting their psychologically very, very hard. And seeking solution where refugees and host community can peacefully coexisting is, I think it's the utmost importance. And the government role here is just need to be the enabling agencies by providing regulations, that protects what you call any initiatives of social inclusion is, I think it's the the least that they can do, whenever, the civil society or the international organization like IOM or UNHCR advocating for economic empowerment, the government needs to, issue any letter that protects that initiative, and even the education. So I think for now, that's the low-hanging fruit, I think, for the advocacies that we can do in Indonesia. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking then that for you, the most important change that could be made would be greater support of agencies and NGOs by the government?
I would think so. And in terms of the regulation, because we don't have any what you call umbrella of law that protects any kind of initiative. So, for example, like we are advocating the rights to work, right? So we do not we a lot of organization in Indonesia conducting pilot programs, but they are still still having problems with immigration. If people found to be working, or even entrepreneurship, doing online marketing, that's could causing a lot of problems. And that's because the awareness of the central governments, the provincial governments, or even the lower governments are still have a gap. So even we already talked with the central government, and the regional government said, oh, we don't know anything about that. There's nothing we can do, because in the end of the day, the people on the field is the people with the provincial government, or even the lower government, right? So it is still a lot of finger pointing and overlapping policies between the level of government in Indonesia. So we do still have to communicate better and find solution in terms of the bureaucracy itself.
Thank you, Zico. That's really interesting. Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. So it is quite a complicated issue, but I mean, in terms of policy, it'd be great, of course, if this geographic limitation on the Refugee Convention in Turkey was abolished. In saying that, though, I have to keep in mind that, in a historical context, Turkey has not always applied these rights to European origin refugees, for example, the Bosnians and other groups throughout history. So that's a bit of a gray area. And in addition, I really think there just needs to be a long-term vision, and this doesn't go for Turkey. It goes for anywhere across the world, because when you have the short-term vision, and especially for Syrian refugees, where we see they've been there for such a long time in the country, they need to be integrated at a certain point into social, economic, and other spheres. But at the same time, I think also there needs to be some kind of reality. So I think there's a difference between what I'd like to see and what we'd probably all like to see and what is realistic as steps to move forward. And oftentimes in these kind of discussions, I see there's this kind of grand like macro perspective, which is necessary, but I also think we need to think first about the smaller steps that can lead us to this. I think, in Turkey in particular, the first huge step would be to foster more cooperation between government bodies and agencies that are involved with migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, and even just foreigners in the country. Because the system is extremely fragmented, it's inefficient, and as it is, it's also necessary to have more qualified individuals working the system. At the moment, many people that I've met and others that I've spoken to as well about this issue, the reality is that most people, unfortunately, who are working in these institutions in Turkey lack training, entirely lack experience in relation to even the concept of forced migration and what that kind of means. And many of the challenges that we've discussed here today, that's often lacking in the expertise of those who are in control of these systems. And then the lack of communication between these different organizations, especially in a system where people are in limbo between national institutions, international institutions, and other kind of bodies. So, and then another thing I'd like to see really, and again, this goes outside of the context of Turkey, is the kind of end to this play on words, where we craft names like, the guesthood or the temporary protection or conventional refugee in the Turkish context. But, this issue goes outside of Turkey and it has been in many other groups as well. And it's kind of a way to evade responsibility for governments to kind of shy away from the responsibility they have to specific groups of people. Another example, this just comes to mind for me in my own research. It's, in 1989, there was an expulsion of Bulgarian Turks from Bulgaria under the communist regime. And there's still this debate today of this being a tourist excursion or an issue of forced migration. And, just the kind of the language that we use around these issues has an incredible impact, I think. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed in all contexts, and that's a societal-wide issue. Back on the question as well, I'd like to add that, a huge thing looking forward is also to ensure, as I mentioned before, that refugees do know their rights. As I said earlier, oftentimes these migration asylum regimes, they rely on the fact that refugees don't know their rights to function. And this has been persistently the case in many contexts, but there also needs to be kind of responsibility from authorities, as has been mentioned by the others as well, because if you're a refugee, chances are you're not spending your time reading up on laws and policies and all kinds of things. You don't have time for this. You're dealing with other more pressing daily challenges and even just basic survival needs. So we need to also rely on having trained authorities who can provide this information in a clear manner, and also with, kind of more integrity in the system. And in Turkey, and specifically, this is definitely not the case at the moment, in my view. And it's a really important starting point, I think, is like having people who are involved in these systems and enforcing these laws to be trained and really have the knowledge to understand the issues that people are facing on an individual level. So that's, I'll leave that there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think there's some really interesting stuff there. I completely agree about the need for states to actually provide information more effectively, because you wouldn't expect even people who have lived in a country all their life to know their entire legal system and all of the legislation on the books. So it seems even more absurd to expect people who haven't lived there all their lives to have an understanding of all of the legislation they need and all of the different systems they have to navigate to actually regularize their status. And yet that seems to be what we expect of people a lot of the time. We've had a really interesting question from the audience, which Sophia has already typed out an answer to. But Laura and Zico, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it if you have any thoughts on it. What they're saying is, what the question is whether panelists think that it's more important to ratify the Refugee Convention or the Stateless Convention for non-signatory states, or whether states should focus more on strengthening their national regulations and policies before stepping up to the regional or the international instruments. Is that something either of you has any thoughts on?
Sure, I can say a few things on that. I mean, from my perspective, personally, even many of these issues persist in states even that have ratified the convention. And so this is definitely a starting point where, I would love to see more countries ratify the convention. Turkey's not the only country that has this geographic limitation as well. So, there are other countries, I'd love to see this be hashed out, but I'm not sure that that's the only solution. So I would say that the answer lies, I don't have a specific answer, but my opinion would lie somewhere more in between of, having both national legislation and international legislation. But even then, I think really one of the biggest things to look forward to is societal change and the changing of mindsets. Because a lot of times, no matter what laws are in place, the implementation of those laws is a completely different story. And oftentimes that relies on societal norms, societal values, because the people who are implementing these laws are also their people as well. And so they're also influenced by, the kind of norms that we have in society. So I think my answer would be both national and international legislation are extremely important in tandem, but really I think kind of a widespread change of values is one of the most important things, even more so than that, in my opinion. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
And for me, I think Laura put it better, definitely more than me. And I echo the sentiment. And for Indonesia, I think the latter is much more important because we don't see and we cannot see in the foreseeable future that Indonesia will sign the Refugee 1951 Convention. And I think the dynamics between the other countries in the regions also, I think we don't see the Malaysia and Thailand at least to sign the 1951 Refugee Convention anytime soon. And I think between those three countries is, still kind of a wait and see situation. Will my neighbor sign the convention, or will my neighbor, do anything different with the refugee management regulation? So I think based on the conversation we have with the government colleagues, I think we have middle ground where if Indonesia does not want to sign the 1951 regulation, so I think it would be better for us to have a regulation in terms of refugee handling with the Indonesian context. So that's what we get with the Presidential Regulation 125/2016, which even though it does not recognize or don't have any provision about refugee rights, but at least we have a certain regulation that protects on how people can declare asylums in Indonesia. So that's a very small win, but we'll take it anyway. Because without that, we don't have any progress. And also Indonesia is parties to at least 7 from 8 core human rights treaties. So for example, Convention on the Rights of the Child, it states every child, not only Indonesian child, right? So refugee children are still, we still need to honor their rights for education. So it does not put Indonesia in an excuse to not honoring or fulfilling the refugee rights living in Indonesia, because we are a party for the other human rights international instruments. So yeah, I think that's the the argument that we are sending over and over to the government, that protecting refugees in Indonesia is not only going to benefit the refugee itself, but also will benefit the Indonesian society in general, because by doing that, it will provide people between refugees and the host community living peacefully peacefully coexistence. So yeah, I think that's my 2 cents on the questions. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. And to our anonymous questioner, I hope that sufficiently answers the question for you. I think that's probably a good time to bring it to an end, really. It's a shame that we weren't able to get the perspectives from Central Asia or West Africa, but we'll try and get Shulkhat and Priscilla on a webinar in the future. So for now, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our amazing panelists, Zico Pestalozzi, Laura Brody, and Sofia Cordonets. And I hope we'll all be able to have another discussion together soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Surely, Daniel. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.
And yes, we'll be uploading this recording to YouTube later today for anyone who's missed it or would like to watch it again. And yeah, thank you very much for the discussion. Goodbye.
Sure. Have a good evening from Indonesia.
Thank you. You too.